Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today at our Funding a US Study webinar. My name is Basha Dudek. I'm an Education USA advisor. I'm based at the US-UK Fulbright Commission in London. And today we're joined by Bryce Benton, Senior Associate Director of Admission from Denison University. Before we get started, just so you're aware, the webinar will be recorded and will be available for you later on this week. And we will also take questions at the end, but if you have any questions throughout the webinar, you could just pop it in the Q&A box and we'll try to answer as many questions as we can. Bryce, over to you then.
Thank you, Basha, and good evening, I suppose, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining this session today. As Basha mentioned, my name is Bryce Benton. I represent Denison University. We're in the beautiful state of Ohio, where it's a nice 21 degrees Celsius right now and sunny, so we'll take that for March. And I've been here at Denison for almost 8 years. In addition to kind of overseeing the admission of international students to the college, I oversee our financial aid and scholarship process for international students as well. And this session is titled Funding US Study, everyone's favorite topic. We're going to talk about money today. And really, this is just designed to be sort of an introduction to looking at financial aid and scholarship options, understanding the terminology and the basics of how the process works, which, you know, if you've done any research, you'll find is quite unique to the US and quite different from maybe what you would find in the UK. Like a lot of things in the US, we like to make things unnecessarily complicated, and there's no standardization across how institutions do things. And I would say it's a massive country with a lot of different policies at the institutional level. But hopefully this will give you a basic overview of how the process works. I'll try to speak broadly, you know, about the process, but again, understand that it can be challenging when drilling down to the institutional level, and there might be some differences right at that level. But try to give you a good broad understanding. I'll try to maybe use Denison in particular as an example as well as we go through. But next slide, please. So just to start here, I just want to give you an idea of something that's important to understand right away before we start talking about things like financial aid, like scholarships, discounts, other financing options. It's just understanding the cost of attendance first. And that's going to be important to know. Obviously, there's a huge range of cost of attendance at different institutions in the United States. This is an example of Denison's cost of attendance for, I think, this current academic year, so the 23-24 academic year. And it's important to understand the colleges that universities that you're applying to. What do they cost? Just the sticker price, what we call the sticker price, the base cost, right? So if you paid the full fees of that institution, what would you be paying out of pocket on a per year basis? And they might break it down in different ways. Obviously, you have tuition, housing, meals being pretty standard as a part of most packages, but maybe some universities don't require that you live on campus, in which case, you know, maybe housing and meals wouldn't be a part of your, you know, what you pay the institution as that cost of attendance. So some colleges will include different things, some will exclude certain things, but this is typically what you would expect to see in terms of the base core costs, and these represent typically the largest costs associated with going to the university. You can see Denison's quite expensive. We're a private, smaller, more intimate living and learning environment, so it costs a little bit more on our campus to educate a student. We're also a private institution, meaning we don't receive funding from the state or federal governments for our operating budget. Compared to like public institutions, which maybe do receive a part of their funding from state or federal governments. So it is a bit more expensive at a place like Denison. You'll see a range. You have some institutions, community colleges that are much cheaper in terms of the sticker price. So if cost is important to you, you're looking for a lower cost option, certainly be aware that there's a range of costs. But don't be scared by the sticker price, right? You see it up there because a lot of colleges and universities do offer financial aid and scholarships to discount the cost. So your actual cost of attending a place like Denison may be more similar or competitive to other institutions that have a lower base price or sticker price that don't maybe discount or offer aid and scholarships, right? So it's just something to be aware of. I think what's important at the end of the day as an applicant, as a student, is understanding what am I going to be expected or have to pay each year, towards these costs, and that might be different from the sticker price. All right, so that's a basic overview of cost of attendance. So let's talk, if you go to the next slide, we'll talk about some terminology. Just some important things to know as you're moving forward. We'll go into more detail on some of these concepts in later slides. Need-based financial aid, you'll hear that term talked about a lot. That's basically just financial aid that's awarded based on the student or family's ability to contribute towards the costs. So it's need-based in that way, in terms of financial need-based. Merit awards, or you might hear these referred to as scholarships. These are typically merit-based from a variety of factors, typically academic performance being a primary one. But that's separate from need-based, in that those awards are typically offered based on merit in your application. Need-blind admission is a process of admission in which your ability to contribute financially towards the cost is not factored into the admission process. So a lot of universities will not factor in finances, but many will factor in finances in the admission review process. And that's what's known as need aware or need sensitive, which your ability to pay and contribute towards those costs may be used as a factor in the admission process to varying degrees. And that can vary by the college, or maybe how much need you have or how much funding you're seeking. Meaningful demonstrated need is a process by which, if admitted, a student has all their financial need accounted for in the initial financial aid package, so that there's no gaps that exist in funding, right? So the students and families' contribution is one part, and then the rest of the cost, would be covered by the institution through grants, scholarships, or other things like work study, but there's no gaps that exist in funding. So finances shouldn't be a barrier for you to attend if that institution has a process by which they meet the full demonstrated of every student they admit. Not necessarily every university would meet full demonstrated need. So it's something to look out for as well. On the next slide, we'll talk just briefly, kind of expand on some of those. These are some aid models that you might see different universities practicing in their process. So a university could be need blind and meet full demonstrated need. This is pretty rare. There's only a handful of US universities that do not consider your ability to pay as a part of the admission process, and also, if admitted, meet your full needs, so there's no gaps that exist in funding. Typically, those institutions that do have this model are highly selective, very resource wealthy types of institutions. So it can be pretty difficult just to be admitted to these types of institutions in the first place, right? So although it might be appealing to have a process that's need blind and then having your need met if you're admitted, understand that sometimes it can be challenging to be admitted in the first place because it's such a small number of schools that are able to do that. A more common model you'll see is the next one, need sensitive and meet full demonstrated need. That's what we do at Denison, in which we do factor in your ability to contribute financially towards the costs. But if admitted, we make sure there's no gaps that exist in funding. Another model is need blind and not meeting full demonstrated need. So a college might not consider your ability to pay, but also may not offer you enough aid and scholarships relative to what you can afford to reasonably be able to attend, right? I mentioned that earlier as something called gapping, right? They'll admit you, but there might be a gap that exists in your funding and what they can offer you. Yeah, and then some universities and colleges in the US offer need-based financial aid only to international students. Some may offer only merit-based scholarships. Some may offer a combination of both. And then some may offer no funding at all to international students, right? And you'll probably hear me, stress on this a lot, but it definitely is important to check with each college or university you're applying to get a good understanding of what model they use, what types of aid they offer, what their sticker price is, and then from there kind of determine, is this going to be a reasonable, good option for me to apply. All right, so the next slide here, we'll talk about, if you go one more. So we'll dive a little bit deeper into need-based aid, and then a little bit later, we'll dive deeper into merit aid and kind of what that looks like, how that process works. But the first one we'll talk about here is need-based financial aid. So need-based aid is determined by establishing what's called an expected family contribution, or an EFC. This is basically the figure, the dollar amount that is demonstrated by you as the applicant that you can afford for the cost of attendance. And that could be anything from 0 up to the full cost or anywhere in between. And we'll talk about like how that's established as we go through. There's some different applications and forms that you would complete depending on the institution you're applying to basically establish an EFC in terms of your financial aid. Most need-based aid, or most universities that offer need-based aid to international students specifically, are private institutions of the US. So just something to bear in mind. Again, not all universities in the US offer need-based aid to international students. It's probably a minority of institutions that do, and the majority of those that do tend to be private institutions, as opposed to like state universities like Ohio State, which is just down the street from us at Denison in Ohio. Many different forms you could complete, right? And you'll see some common applications out there that we'll cover, but be sure you're checking with each institution on what they require in terms of applying for need-based aid. And next slide. This is just to give you an idea of where the broader picture of where funding typically comes from in terms of international students funding their study in the US. As you can see here, this is a bit outdated, but I would suspect it's held pretty true. It's almost 10 years old now. But this is really just to show that, majority of funding is funded by the student and family, in terms of the typical student and what they contribute towards the cost. Obviously, there are pretty substantial grants and scholarships like that available. It accounts for 17% of the funding picture. And then obviously there are other sources like on-campus employment where you might be able to earn a little extra money, which is pretty widely available at most universities. Maybe your local government or local organizations might be able to offer some loans or scholarships or things like that. But just want to give you a breakdown and kind of stress the idea that funding typically is it is the responsibility of the student and family, and colleges have varying degrees of which they can discount and are, sort of have an appetite to discount that cost relative to a variety of factors. All right, so this is kind of diving into how need is determined. How do you what is an expected family contribution? Just getting to the basics of that. It's a really simple formula. You have the cost of attendance that we talked about the first slide, minus your expected family contribution would equal your need, or the remaining number that you would need to meet to be able to afford the cost. Again, EFC is determined by a variety of applications, so that'll come from those. But that's how your need is determined by the institution that you're applying to, right? So if you're applying to Denison, the estimated cost of attendance last year, $74,000. Your expected contribution is $24,000. Roughly your need would be $50,000, right? Would be that gap that you would need to be filled. All right, so I mentioned that there's a lot of a variety of need-based financial aid applications and forms out there that you could submit as an international student applying for financial aid. The most popular are probably the top two. The CSS profile is something administered by the College Board, which is the same organization that administers the SAT, AP courses, and things like that. They also have their own financial aid application. We at Denison, we do require the CSS profile, but not from international students, right? So you might find some universities that do ask you to file or complete the CSS profile and send it to them. Again, that can vary by school, but that's a pretty common one that you'll see where there's a small fee. You complete it online. It's a pretty in-depth application. Another that you'll come across is the ISAFA, which is a paper-based form you can find online. It was put together by the International Association for College Admission Counseling in the US, and it's just a basic paper-based form that a lot of institutions accept, where you tell us about your financial information, your parents, their salaries, your family size, your assets, your income, things like that. Some institutions have their own form, like at Denison, we have our own Denison Certification of Finances that all international students complete when they apply. You might see the term the FAFSA, which is only a form that's only US citizens and permanent residents are eligible to file, because it's the pre-application for federal student aid. So this is the form that you would complete to qualify for any federal and state grant and loan programs, which if you were a non-citizen or permanent resident, you wouldn't be eligible for. Yeah, so a variety of forms there, but those are some common ones that you'll see. Along with these forms, some colleges, universities may ask for additional documentation or evidence to support the information you're providing on those forms. You can imagine what those are, and that they're kind of listed out here, that the common documentation, tax forms, bank statements, things like that. So it's good just to have access to these. At Denison, to use as an example, when someone submits a certification of finances, we don't require bank documentation or supporting documentation, but we may request it in certain cases where we need more evidence to support the information that's on the form, right? So good just to pay attention to what they're asking for. Make sure you ask questions if you're not sure what they're looking for, or if a certain form or something would work. But yeah, this is something to expect. All U.S. universities are required to verify the student source of funding in order to issue the I-20. So most universities, when you apply, if you're admitted and enroll, would issue an I-20 at that time, and we're required by the U.S. government to verify the student source of funding in order to issue that document to support a student visa application at a U.S. embassy or consulate. So we're required by the government to verify that funding at some point, but in order to issue the I-20, some will ask for those additional documents at the time you apply, some may not. Yeah, so kind of covered this a little bit on the last slide when we talked about this form. This is a free application to complete. If you're really tight on funding and a university requires the CSS profile, for example, and that may cost $20 or so to send to each institution, you can always ask, like, do you accept this form? I think a lot will accept this form in lieu of the profile if you ask. But this is a common form you would see that's free to use. Yeah, like I mentioned, this is essentially the private version of the FAFSA. It's a CSS profile. I think it stands for College Scholarship Search or Service or something. The acronym has sort of become obsolete. It's essentially just a need-based financial aid application. It's a private version of FAFSA. This is what we call the institutional aid application. So you'd be filling this out to see what you would qualify for in terms of institutional funding. But again, at Denison, we don't accept this for international students. So just be sure to check with each school. Some schools might provide fee waiver codes for the CSS profile as well. So if that cost is a concern, you could always ask if there's some fee waiver codes available. The college might have a certain amount of those to give out each cycle. All right, so this is an example of Denison certification of finances, just to give you kind of an idea of kind of what these typically look like. And pretty straightforward. We at Denison, I think, have done a lot of work to simplify this process, because if you ever complete the CSS profile, I think you'll quickly realize that it's a pretty onerous application. Like, they ask for a lot of information from not just you as a student, but your family, right? And some that you may need to do some digging to figure out the appropriate answer for. We've distilled our process down pretty significantly at Denison to basically just some limited family information, and you as the student and family telling us what you can afford on that certification of finances form. But something to check for, right? Just look, most universities' websites, if they have a financial aid page, which they should, that highlights specific requirements for international students. You'll see what they're going to expect you to complete in terms of the form and when you're supposed to submit that. And make sure you read through those forms carefully, just to see what they expect you to include, and then ask questions if you're not sure of something. Better to ask the question of the office, get an answer, than to complete the form incorrectly. Because at Denison, like, we have a very high volume of applications, and we have to process those quickly. So if someone it looks like they maybe misunderstood the form and put something in that might not be right, we don't necessarily have the time to then reach back out to that student, verify, right? So you need to make sure that you're filling it correctly the first time. So the second major, so we talked, that was quick primer on need-based financial aid. And you'll see need-based financial aid typically awarded in the form of grants in an admit package, and like how we determine need and all that through that process. Next is so a little bit about merit scholarships or merit funding, merit aid. And this varies very widely by institution, because most scholarships are awarded to you by the college or by the university, and they have obviously a lot of autonomy to build in their own process and how they want to award and give out their own money, right? So you'll just see a huge range of processes when it comes to applying for scholarships at the colleges and universities you're applying to. But to give you a basic overview, merit-based is typically academically focused, but it could be based on a variety of factors, right? Like SAT or ACT, other sort of academic criteria. There might be some universities that offer, like, if you have this threshold, like this GPA, this SAT score or above, you automatically get this award. So they might outline some criteria like that. Typically, they're competitive scholarships. Like at Denison, we award scholarships holistically, based on pretty much a combination of all the criteria that we consider, and when reviewing students for admission. So it varies. You might see some that are like that threshold, automatic awards, some that are more holistic and vary by cycle and by student and amount. And then there's some that are awarded for a variety of other reasons outside of the traditional academic criteria. Athletics, obviously, university athletics are a big deal here in the U.S. And if you're an NCAA Division I school, you might be able to offer some athletic scholarships. You might see some for special talents like abilities in arts, or other areas. So like at Denison, we offer specific scholarships for studio arts, cinema, music, dance, and theater. So you might see that, in which case they might ask you to submit like a portfolio of your work to qualify for those. In some cases, the scholarships are awarded by the admissions office. In some cases, they're awarded by a faculty committee based on review of a portfolio or an audition or something like that. But typically, they tend to be competitive, and the amounts and the types vary pretty widely by institutions. And then there are some external scholarships to keep in mind too. You can go to the next slide. Some external scholarships too that would not be institutionally funded that you could always, and I think we'll talk about that as we go through. And this is just kind of to give you another, there is a big range, right, of different scholarships. Most universities would, if they do offer a different set of scholarships, would, like I know at Denison, we have on our website, we have a description of our different scholarship programs, so you can see what exists at that college and what you might be competitive for, or might be a good candidate for. And then some of them are very just general and broad and don't have a lot of fixed requirements for them as well. All right. Yeah, so college funding by entry level. So, and this is like depending on whether you're applying for undergraduate, if you're transferring, or maybe applying to a graduate program. I think most of you are probably at the undergraduate level, or maybe looking to apply after you graduate from high school. So the process might be different, right? If you're applying as a first-year student, as opposed to applying as a transfer student after attending another university or college, they might offer different levels of funding or different types of funding to first-year applicants versus transfers. For graduate school, it could be different as well. So that's an important distinction just to keep in mind. Am I applying as a first year? What are first-year students eligible for? If you're applying as transfers, is it something different? And then at grad school, that is usually very different. Usually it comes from faculty funding, departmental funding, in terms of financial aid scholarships and things like that. So just something to be mindful of. I'm going to the next slide. We talked a bit about this. Again, there should be good scholarship information for each university's or each university that you're applying to. Check the financial aid website or financial aid office or the admission website for that sort of information. You can always reach out to if there's not the detail that you need, or if you have questions about that, or it's not on the website. And then obviously, like I said earlier, there are some outside scholarships that do exist. It's always helpful to check with local organizations, maybe someone like Education USA or the Fulbright, or other sort of organizations that you know and trust that might offer some type of outside funding as well. When to apply for scholarships? So again, like a lot of things, it's going to vary pretty significantly by universities, just because each university has different timelines sometimes. Like there's not a universal, you have to apply by this date, right, for all universities. So like I say, usually they're offered year round. Always good to try to apply early and get in early to be considered for scholarships and admission. So just something to keep in mind, right? If a college has an early action or early decision round, they're a top choice. it's a good idea. It might increase some odds of maybe being admitted or receiving some funding. So always good as an option if they do offer that to apply early. But it does vary considerably by school. Some might have specific deadlines for scholarship applications that you would have to adhere to. At Denison, as an example, we don't have a separate scholarship application, so your admission application is your scholarship application as well. So the timeline is the same as the general application and admission timeline for scholarships too. But yeah, like I said, a lot of the deadlines are in that kind of right now timeline, February, March, April, because that's when a lot of colleges and universities are making admission decisions and filling their class, and probably majority of people have applied at that point, and they can better get a sense of the bigger picture, how much funding they have to get out, competitiveness of the pool of students, and make those decisions appropriately. And typically, when you're admitted to a university, that's when you should also receive a scholarship or financial aid decision. That's not always the case. If you applied separately for a scholarship that institution provides, they might give you a decision on that later on. But that's typically how it can work, so you can make an informed decision there around cost before committing. Yeah, in terms of like just organizing your materials for the scholarship applications, definitely good to prepare for in advance. These are some common things that you'll have to consider if a university does require a separate scholarship application. This is typically what they might ask for. So just good things to be prepared for. A lot of these you may already be doing as a part of your admission application, so it might not be a ton of extra work, hopefully. But yeah, definitely some good things just to be prepared for. And when those scholarship applications do become live and you start applying for those, if they do have separate ones. So again, there's a lot of scholarships that exist out there, and my main recommendation, just in terms of how to navigate the process and how to approach it, just get a list of institutions or universities that you're interested in and you would want to apply to, and then start there and do some research on that smaller scale. See what's available at the institution, make sure you understand those applications and deadlines for those scholarships. And you can also, research outside scholarship sources, and it's good to do that early in the process. And obviously those would have varying deadlines just depending on the program. But again, similar to like what I mentioned earlier with the certification of finances, typically when you fill out a separate scholarship application, you want to make sure everything's correct the first time. So make sure you read through everything carefully. You might not have an opportunity to make corrections later on. And then make sure, again, it's an organization, if it is an outside scholarship, an organization that you know and trust, that would be potentially offering you some outside scholarship funding. But yeah, and then the next slide. Right, so we talked a lot about the sources of funding and the different models and terms. And we talked about the main cost of attendance, which includes tuition, housing, and meals. Some other costs that you should account for that may or may not be included in the cost of attendance listed on a university's website, but nevertheless are costs that you'd have to prepare for and pay for, are listed up here. And these are, in many cases, variable costs. Obviously, the CEBIS fee is fixed. That's $350. It's a one-time fee. A lot of these are variable as well, but just something to be mindful of. You would have to, every student who's in the US enrolled at an institution has to show evidence of health insurance coverage. This can be purchased through the institution or university. It could also be something that you buy and show evidence of outside insurance coverage. So that could be a variable cost as well. A lot of universities will require students to show proof of vaccination, inoculations. So just things like that. And the main, I think, in addition to these fees, like you would have things like transportation, like getting to campus, things like books and supplies for your courses would be an extra cost. Often you're able to work on campus, and this can be a good way to earn some extra money to put towards these costs. But certainly a lot of extra costs just to keep in mind when you're budgeting in your process. So you're budgeting appropriately. Just some things to keep in mind in terms of the financial aid process. Just know that honest representation of your finances is really important. Obviously, our goal on the university side is when we're offering need-based financial aid, is to offer it to students who truly need it, right? So otherwise they wouldn't be able to attend, right, based on the cost. And that's what we hope for in everybody in the process, is just that everyone's honest about their financial situation, and the process should work out as it's intended. I will say with the CSS profile, they do spot checks and verification of information. So while they don't do it for everybody, a certain percentage of all applicants get randomly selected to verify the information they include on the application. So there are some checks and balances on that side of the process. But just know that we treat this information with the utmost privacy and confidentiality. Obviously, this information is secure in our system. We don't share it with anyone other than the student in terms of advising and working with you through the process. And then, obviously seeking help, asking questions if you have it. It's inherently a pretty complicated process, especially if you're doing it for the first time, especially coming from a different country, right, where you maybe didn't grow up with these terms and kind of understanding these things. Definitely ask questions and seek help and provide evidence to support, what you're claiming on those forms. So be prepared to. All right, so some things to keep in mind, some other kind of miscellaneous points here. I don't actually know if this first point is true. I don't think we've had many students from the UK apply student loans from the UK to the US. Okay. So yes, yeah, if you qualify for loans that are maybe UK funded, they wouldn't transfer to wouldn't be able to use those at a US institution. If you know that cost is a big factor for you, you have a very fixed budget, a limited budget, try to only consider schools where you feel like that they can meet your budget needs, whether that's a low cost of attendance and a low sticker price, or a school that might meet full need for everyone they admit and offer, deep discounts. But you definitely want to make sure you're applying to a good schools that fit your need range. Yeah, and the thing to keep in mind, like I said earlier, we talked about this in terms of the models. A school that meets 100% of demonstrated need may not be need blind. So just something to be aware of, like Denison is an example of that, where if admitted, it should be affordable for every student we admit to attend because we meet full need, but we will consider the family's financial resources in our admission review process and ability to pay, just because the less you can contribute, that's more we have to offer in institutionally funded financial aid scholarships in order for that student to attend. And I wish we could, but unfortunately we can't, fully fund everyone that we admit. So just something to keep in mind. Also, cost of attendance at U.S. universities on average rises about 2 or 3% each year. Cost for tuition, housing, meals. This is pretty typical cost of inflation. Roughly, it's typically pegged to that when inflation isn't crazy. But a lot of institutions have varying policies on this, so it's a good question to ask if you're really trying to budget out for your entire program in later years of your program, and because most undergraduate programs in the U.S. are 4 years. What am I going to be expected to pay in the second, third, and fourth year? Because typically universities will build you an initial financial aid package based on the first year's cost of attendance. At Denison, for example, your expected financial contribution is fixed at the time of your admission, and it doesn't change throughout your 4 years. So even as the cost of attendance may rise a bit each year, your contribution would remain the same throughout your program. But not every university does that. That might impact your ultimate cost. So just something good to keep in mind, that the cost of attendance does increase 2 or 3 percentage points each year. One other thing I will mention about that in terms of the cost of attendance rising a bit each year. Yeah, so different institutions will approach it differently. In 2 or 3% again is an estimate, not necessarily like a given that it will increase. So you might not be able to get like definitive guidance, which is kind of a catch-22, because obviously it's important to budget for the full 4-year program. So definitely a good question to ask, and hopefully they'll be able to give you a good direct answer on what you can expect in later years. Some colleges and universities might ask you to reapply for need-based financial aid each year. If you are based in the US, you're expected to file a FAFSA each year, and that your need might change from year to year, and therefore your eligibility for need-based aid might change. So that's another question that's something good to keep in mind. Am I expected to reapply for financial aid each year? And how does that work for the later years of the program?
Great. Thank you, Bryce. That was very informational or informative, if I used the right correct English. We have one question so far, but if anyone has any other questions for us. So if you could answer this, is a US citizen studying in the UK and then applying to a US university, sorry, as a US student, as a US citizen studying in the UK and then applying to a US university, would they be considered an international student or a domestic student? How does that work? Because we do have quite a few students that are studying their A levels here, and they are either a dual US UK national, or they have US citizenship as well.
Right, right. So the answer is sort of both. You would be considered a domestic student for aid purposes. So if you're a U.S. citizen, a permanent resident, regardless of where you're currently living, going to high school, you would be expected to, if you're applying for need-based aid, file a FAFSA, and you could qualify for, federal and state aid. So in that way, you would be considered a domestic applicant for financial aid purposes. Although, because you're coming from a school outside of the US, you'd likely be considered an international student in terms of like who's reading your application. People in the admission office who have familiarity with the British style curriculum and can read your application appropriately in that context. So it's not like they would be comparing your academic background to a US student in that way. So you kind of be both, like international in terms of your academics in that context, but then you'd be considered a domestic student for aid purposes.
And then can I just ask with that, in regards to the aid purposes, would they then be, would that student be qualified for like international scholarships, or would they just have to apply for the domestic scholarships? Because that's another question that we kind of get asked outside of the financial aid aspect.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, to use an example, at Denison, we don't really have scholarships that are specific to domestic versus international. Well, I take that back. There are a few scholarships that international students wouldn't be eligible for, in which case, yeah, the distinction there would be if you're a US citizen or permanent resident, you could qualify for those. But that's only a few exceptions. So for us, it wouldn't make much of a difference in terms of the scholarships, what you could qualify for, regardless whether you're international or domestic. But yeah, there are some scholarships out there, whether institutionally funded or not, where one of the eligibility criteria might be that you're a U.S. citizen. So that is something to watch out for. But I can't really necessarily speak on behalf of other institutions, but at least at Denison, I know majority of our scholarships do not have that, qualifying criteria. So yeah, you would be considered for and be eligible for scholarships just like any other student, domestic or international.
Great. We have one more question. Is it possible to apply for funding after you are accepted in case of change of circumstances? And how likely will colleges grant funding in this case?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I mean, from what I've seen, most colleges and universities here expect the student. Well, one important distinction is that whether or not you apply for financial aid with your application for admission. So if you apply for admission, like to use Denison again, if you apply for admission to Denison and you indicate, no, I do not want to be considered for financial aid. If after you're admitted, you then come back and say, yes, I want to be considered for need-based financial aid, we have a policy in which you would have to indicate that on your initial application that you want to be considered for need-based aid. You wouldn't be able to go back after the fact and say, never mind, I want to be considered for need-based aid, and then submit a form at that time to be considered. So we expect all students, when you apply, to tell us yes or no, you want to be considered for need-based financial aid. If you do apply for need-based financial aid and you're admitted and your circumstances change, which obviously can happen, the policies are probably going to vary widely by university, just in terms of how they might be able to accommodate that change. And it probably depends on how much the change is, when you're requesting that change, and so forth. But you would just have to contact the school. I could, to set appropriate expectations, I would say that probably not. I wouldn't go into the process expecting to be able to change your need level and get additional need-based aid after you've already been admitted. Because usually when universities admit you, like a place like Denison, we admit you, we use that financial information as a part of our admission review process, right? So if your finances then substantially change from that point to something else, something where you need a lot more funding, that may change the nature of our original decision, right? Too. So we have a policy in which we don't allow newly admitted and first-year students to appeal for additional financial aid, and we tell students when admitted that you really should not expect to receive additional funding in your later years through the program, right? Like our financial aid budget is pretty fixed. We award the most we can at the time of admission. We don't necessarily set aside additional funds for continuing students to increase awards. That said, we have an appeals process, right? Because you can imagine there's a variety of things that can happen. And we do set aside some emergency sources of funding for students who are in truly, unforeseen, substantial sort of circumstances that have changed their financial ability to pay. We can review those and consider those. But you should expect whatever your expected financial contribution is on those initial forms that you complete as a part of your admission process. That's what you're going to be eligible for. And I wouldn't necessarily rely on or count on being able to get additional funding after you've already been admitted and your application's been reviewed. So yeah, just something to be mindful of. Plus, like when you apply and you submit a form, right? Like say you apply to Dennis and you submit the certification of finances in December or January, right? Our deadline's January 15th is our main application deadline. And then you're admitted in March, and then you turn around, get that offer, and then in April you appeal for additional funding. We would have a lot of questions about what changed from December or January to April to impact your finances so substantially, right? So that's a short period of time in which so you would need to be mindful of that. If you are asking for additional funding, you need to make sure you provide a lot of evidence as to why your circumstances have changed, how much they've changed, and why you need the additional funding if you are appealing. That again, I think the main thing to underscore that's probably going to vary significantly by college, and I wouldn't expect to be able to get additional funding after you've already been admitted and your original package has been built.
And then can you just remind everyone when people or students can start applying for financial aid?
Yeah. So we at Denison, when you apply for admission, your certification of finances is part of your application checklist. So in order to complete your application to college, you would have to submit your financial information to us, right? So that would mean it's sort of due at the time that your application and supporting documents are expected. That might vary again by college, just in terms of when they ask for those forms to be submitted, but I think majority will expect those forms to be submitted as the same as the application deadline. Or if not, they'll list a separate deadline for financial aid forms.
Great. There's no other questions. So I think we're done for today. Bryce, once again, thank you so much for running this webinar for us. Very informational. And like I said before, the webinar is recorded and will be available for viewing later this week, probably before Friday. Bryce, enjoyed the wonderful weather in Ohio and send the sunshine this way because it's a bit miserable here today.
Yeah, well, I'm sure it'll just wait a few days. They always say about Ohio, if you don't like the weather today, wait until tomorrow. So I'm sure the gray skies and a little bit cooler weather will be here. But yeah, I'll do my best and hopefully you get some.
That's great. Thank you so much. And Bryce, have a good day, and everyone else have a good evening. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.